Emma Sullivan was a 42-year-old history teacher with dark brown hair and tired eyes. She loved teaching about the past, especially the Civil War. Today she was visiting her grandmother in the hospital. Emma's grandmother, Eleanor Ellie Montgomery Sullivan, was 98 years old and very sick. The doctors said she didn't have much time left. Eleanor had always been a strong woman with bright blue eyes that could see right through any lie. Now she lay in bed looking small and weak. Emma walked down the clean, white hospital hallway. The smell of cleaning supplies filled the air. She could hear the beeping of machines as she got closer to room 307. "Grandma?" Emma said softly as she entered the room. Eleanor looked up from her bed. Though her body was weak, her eyes were still sharp and clear. "There you are," Eleanor said. Her voice was stronger than Emma expected. "I was worried you wouldn't get here in time." Emma sat in the chair next to the bed and carefully took her grandmother's hand. The skin felt paper-thin and cool to the touch. "How are you feeling today?" Emma asked. "Like I'm dying," Eleanor said bluntly. "No need to pretend otherwise." She looked toward the door. "Did you come alone? Where's your mother?" "Mom will be here tomorrow. She couldn't get an earlier flight." Eleanor nodded, looking almost happy about this news. "Good. I need to talk to you alone first." Her fingers tightened around Emma's hand. "I don't have much time left." "Don't talk like that, Grandma. The doctor said you might have weeks." "Doctors don't know everything," Eleanor cut her off. "I can feel it. My time is coming soon." She tried to sit up, and Emma quickly helped adjust her pillows. "There's something important I need to tell you. Something I should have told you years ago." Emma felt worried. Her grandmother had started getting confused sometimes in recent months. "What is it?" Eleanor looked straight into Emma's eyes. "It's about your great-grandfather. My father." "James Montgomery?" Emma smiled. "The Civil War hero? I know all his stories, Grandma. You've told me many times." Eleanor gave a small, sad laugh. "Stories? Yes, that's exactly what they were. Just stories." She shook her head slowly. "Everything you know about our family's Civil War history is a lie." Emma stared at her grandmother in shock. The Montgomery family history was well known in their family. James Montgomery was a decorated Union soldier who had fought bravely in many important battles. His medals were proudly displayed in Emma's mother's living room. The family had kept his letters from the war. Emma even used some of them when teaching her students about the Civil War. "Grandma, I think you might be confused. We have his medals and letters." "All part of the lie," Eleanor said firmly. Her breathing was getting harder, but her mind seemed clear. "I've kept this secret my whole life. I promised my mother I would never tell anyone. But I can't die with this secret. I just can't." Emma noticed the heart monitor beeping faster. "Maybe we should talk about this later. You need to rest." "There won't be a later for me," Eleanor insisted. She pointed to the small drawer in the table beside her bed. "Help me. Look in there." Emma opened the drawer and found a small, old-looking key. "This opens a hidden compartment in the cedar chest at the foot of my bed at home," Eleanor explained. "You need to get what's inside." "Grandma, what's this all about?" "The truth," Eleanor whispered. "About James. About who he really was." Tears filled her eyes. "He wasn't a hero like everyone thinks. The real story is much more complicated." Emma felt a chill run through her body. "What do you mean?" "Promise me you'll get those papers. Promise you'll read them. Then you can decide what to do with the truth." "I promise," Emma said, though she felt unsure. "But can't you just tell me now?" Eleanor took a deep breath. "It started at the Battle of Bull Run. Everyone said he fought bravely, but he didn't. He couldn't even fire his gun." The old woman's voice grew stronger as she began her story. "He was hiding behind a fallen tree when he heard someone crying in pain nearby. It was a wounded Confederate soldier named William Thompson." Emma sat in her car outside her grandmother's small house, the key clutched tightly in her hand. The morning sun shone on the well-kept garden that Eleanor had tended until she became too frail last year. Emma had promised to come straight to the house after leaving the hospital last night, but she needed time to think. Her grandmother's story had shaken her deeply. All her life, Emma had been proud of her family's Civil War history. James Montgomery was their hero, their connection to an important time in American history. Emma finally got out of the car and walked to the front door. She used her own key to enter the quiet house. Everything was neat and simple, just like Eleanor had always kept it. Family photos lined the hallway, generations of Montgomerys and Sullivans. Emma paused at a framed black and white photograph of a stern-looking man in a Union uniform. James Montgomery, her great-grandfather, stared back at her. "Were you really not the man we thought you were?" Emma whispered to the photograph. She made her way to Eleanor's bedroom. The cedar chest sat at the foot of the neatly made bed, just as it had for as long as Emma could remember. As a child, she had loved opening it to smell the sweet cedar and look at the old quilts stored inside. Today she lifted the lid with different feelings. She removed the quilts and felt around the bottom of the chest. Her fingers found a small crack in the wood. Using the antique key, she unlocked a hidden panel and found a metal box underneath. Emma's hands shook as she lifted it out. The box was heavy and old, with rust on its corners. When she opened it, she found bundles of letters tied with faded ribbons, a small diary, yellowed newspaper clippings, and what looked like a hand-drawn map. She picked up one of the letters. The handwriting was different from the James Montgomery letters she had seen before. This writing was more hurried, less neat. She began to read. October 15, 1861. My dearest Sarah, I hope this letter finds its way to you. William assured me this messenger can be trusted. I think of you every day and dream of a time when this terrible war will end and we might meet without fear. Today I almost got caught passing the information about troop movements. The captain nearly saw me with the maps. I am not made for this deception, but I cannot stand by while more men die needlessly. If both sides know where the other plans to attack, perhaps fewer lives will be lost. I am still not sure if what I'm doing is right or wrong. Am I a traitor? Or am I saving lives? All I know is that when I think of you, I find the courage to continue. Forever yours, James. Emma sat back on the floor, stunned. This was not the brave Union soldier from family stories. This James Montgomery was conflicted, scared, possibly even helping the Confederate side. She picked up the diary next. Opening to a random page, she read, July 3, 1863. The battle at Gettysburg continues. So many dead and wounded. James sent word that major fighting will happen today on the eastern ridge. I've told William to stay away from that area. If anyone discovers I'm passing this information, they'll hang me as a spy. But how can I not try to save my brother? I wonder if there will ever be forgiveness for any of us when this war ends. North and South, we've all done terrible things in the name of our causes. Sarah. Emma spent hours going through the contents of the box. The story that emerged was nothing like the family legend she had been raised with. Her great-grandfather James Montgomery had indeed been a Union soldier, but he was drafted against his will. At the Battle of Bull Run, he had frozen in fear and hidden instead of fighting. While hiding, he discovered a badly wounded Confederate soldier named William Thompson and rather than leaving him to die, helped him reach medical aid. William and James formed an unlikely friendship. Through secret messages they began to communicate. William introduced James to his sister Sarah, who was secretly gathering information for the Confederate Army. James fell in love with her despite their being on opposite sides of the war. What began as James passing harmless information to Sarah about Union movements turned into something more complex when a Union doctor named Marcus Reynolds discovered their arrangement. Instead of reporting James for treason, Dr. Reynolds convinced the couple to work as double agents, providing information that would help minimize civilian casualties on both sides. The most shocking part came near the end of the war. Another soldier with a similar name, James Morrison, performed a heroic act that saved many Union lives. Due to confusion in records, James Montgomery was credited with this bravery. Rather than correct the mistake, he accepted the recognition, partly to protect himself from possible treason charges for his communication with Sarah. After the war, James found Sarah, who was working as a teacher under a different name. They married and built a new life together, never revealing their complicated past. Emma looked up from the papers, her mind spinning. Everything she knew about her family was based on a lie. The medals in her mother's living room belonged to a different man. The letters they had cherished were probably written by someone else or carefully created to maintain the deception. Yet, as she reread the actual letters between James and Sarah, she found a different kind of hero. Not a man of simple bravery on the battlefield, but a complex person trying to save lives on both sides of a terrible conflict. A man who found love across enemy lines and who lived with the weight of his choices for the rest of his life. Emma gathered the papers and returned to the hospital. Eleanor was sleeping when she arrived, but woke when Emma touched her hand. You found them, Eleanor said, her voice barely a whisper. Yes, Emma replied. I read everything. And? Eleanor's blue eyes searched Emma's face. And I think I understand why you kept this secret, Emma said. But I'm not sure I understand why you're telling me now. Eleanor smiled weakly. Because history deserves the truth even when it's complicated. And who better to decide what to do with that truth than my granddaughter, the history teacher? Tell me more about him, Emma said, settling into the chair beside her grandmother's bed. The real James Montgomery, not the hero from our family stories. Eleanor's eyes brightened at the chance to finally speak the full truth. She adjusted herself against the pillows and began. James was just 20 years old when the war started. He was working in his father's store in Ohio. He didn't care much about politics or slavery. He just wanted to live a simple life. Eleanor paused to take a sip of water from the cup Emma held for her. When the draft came, he was terrified. He tried to run away to Canada, but they caught him at the border. They gave him a choice, jail or the army. He chose the army. Emma nodded, thinking of the frightened young man so different from the brave soldier she had imagined all her life. They didn't train them much back then, Eleanor continued. Just a few weeks of marching and how to load a rifle. Then they sent them straight to Bull Run, the first real big battle of the war. James had never even fired his gun at a person before. What happened? Emma asked, though she had already read parts of the story in the letters. When the fighting started, he froze. Couldn't move, couldn't shoot. Men were falling all around him. The noise was terrible, cannons, screaming, horses. He told my mother it was like hell on earth. Eleanor's voice grew softer. When his unit charged forward, he pretended to trip and fell behind a big fallen tree. He stayed there, shaking, while the battle moved on without him. Emma tried to picture her great-grandfather, young and scared, hiding while other men fought and died. He might have stayed there the whole battle, but he heard someone moaning nearby. A Confederate soldier had been hit in the leg and was bleeding badly. That soldier was William Thompson. And James helped him? Emma asked. Eleanor nodded. He couldn't just let him bleed to death, even if he was the enemy. He tied his belt around William's leg to stop the bleeding. Then, when it got dark, he helped William reach a farmhouse where both sides were taking their wounded. Emma thought about this moment, the choice that changed everything. So that's how they became friends? Not right away, Eleanor said. But William never forgot what James did. When they both ended up at the same prison camp a year later, William recognized James and saved him from some rough treatment by the guards. They started talking and realized they had a lot in common, despite fighting on different sides. And Sarah? How did she come into the picture? Eleanor smiled. Sarah was William's sister. She would visit the prison camp, bringing food and supplies. William introduced them. Sarah was a strong-willed woman. She believed in the Confederate cause, but she hated the death and suffering of the war even more. The letters said she was gathering information for the Confederate Army? She wasn't an official spy, but yes, she passed along what she heard, Eleanor explained. After James was released in a prisoner exchange, they arranged to stay in contact through coded messages. James was stationed near the Virginia border then. He started telling Sarah about Union troop movements. Emma frowned. So he was a traitor? Eleanor shook her head slowly. It wasn't that simple. He never gave information that would lead to surprise attacks or ambushes. He mainly shared news about where large forces were gathering, information that both sides usually knew anyway. He thought if both armies knew where the other was planning major movements, they might avoid some of the worst fighting. But that's still helping the enemy, Emma said. Yes, Eleanor admitted. And that's when Dr. Reynolds found out. The Union doctor? How did he discover what James was doing? He caught James writing one of his coded letters. James thought he was done for, expected to be court-martialed and possibly executed for treason. But Dr. Reynolds surprised him. The doctor had lost his brother early in the war and had spent months treating horribly wounded men from both sides. He was tired of the killing. Emma leaned forward, fascinated. So instead of reporting James, he recruited him? Yes. Dr. Reynolds suggested that James and Sarah could help save lives by passing certain information to both sides. Where hospitals were located so they wouldn't be shelled, which towns were about to be in the path of armies so civilians could evacuate. They became what you might call humanitarian spies. The afternoon passed as Eleanor continued her story. She told Emma about close calls James had, about the secret messages hidden in shipments of medical supplies, about the growing love between James and Sarah even as the war kept them apart. Then she came to the part about Gettysburg. The real hero at Gettysburg was a man named James Morrison, not Montgomery, Eleanor explained. He led a charge that helped hold an important position. But in the chaos and poor record-keeping, the reports got mixed up. When officials came looking for James Montgomery to give him a medal after the battle, your great-grandfather didn't correct them. He took credit for another man's bravery? Emma asked, feeling disappointed. He was afraid if he drew attention to the mistake, someone might look more closely at his activities, Eleanor said. By then he and Sarah and Dr. Reynolds had created an extensive network of people helping to minimize civilian casualties. He couldn't risk exposing that. Emma sat back trying to process this information. So our family's hero was actually a reluctant soldier who became a spy and then took credit for someone else's actions. It's hard to see him as anything but a coward and a fraud. Eleanor's blue eyes flashed with sudden anger. No. That's not the whole story. Yes, he was scared at Bull Run. Many men were. Yes, he passed information to both sides. But do you know how many civilian lives their network saved? Hundreds, maybe thousands. She reached for Emma's hand. After the war, when he found Sarah again, they used their own money to help rebuild schools and towns that had been destroyed. They took in 3 orphan children whose parents had been killed in the fighting. For the rest of his life, your great-grandfather worked to heal the wounds of that war, even if no one knew the full truth about his role in it. Emma thought about this for a moment. So he wasn't the hero we thought he was, but he wasn't a villain either. He was human, Eleanor said simply. Flawed, scared sometimes, brave at other times. The real story is more complicated than the simple hero tale we've told for generations. Why did the family keep up the lie after he died? Emma asked. By then the story was part of who we were. My mother knew the truth, but she was afraid of what would happen if people found out. Would they call James a traitor? Would they take back his pension? Would they look at our family differently? Eleanor sighed. So the lie continued. Each generation thinking they were protecting the next. Until now, Emma said. Until now, Eleanor agreed. I'm the last one who knew someone who knew the truth. Once I'm gone, there would be no one left to tell the real story. She squeezed Emma's hand. Now you have to decide what happens to our family's secret. Emma returned to the hospital the next day. Her mother had arrived from Chicago and was sitting at Eleanor's bedside when Emma walked in. There's my history teacher, Eleanor said weakly, giving Emma a meaningful look. Emma's mother, Patricia, stood to hug her daughter. Mom's been asking for you all morning. She keeps saying she has more to tell you about some family history project. It's important, Eleanor insisted from the bed. Patricia smiled and patted her mother's hand. I'm going to get some coffee from the cafeteria. You two can talk about your history stuff. She kissed Eleanor's forehead. Don't tire yourself out, Mom. Once Patricia had left the room, Eleanor motioned for Emma to come closer. Did you bring the box? She whispered. Emma nodded, lifting her bag to show she had it with her. I couldn't leave it at home. Mom might have found it. Good, Eleanor said. There's more I need to explain. Things I couldn't tell you yesterday. Emma pulled her chair close to the bed. I'm listening. Eleanor took a deep breath. I told you about James and Sarah meeting, but not about what happened between them. Their love story was beautiful but dangerous. Because they were on opposite sides, Emma said. Yes. After William introduced them at the prison camp, they only spoke for a few minutes. But something happened between them instantly. Sarah later wrote in her diary that she felt she had known James her whole life. Eleanor's eyes grew distant, remembering. When James was released in the prisoner exchange, he thought he would never see her again. But they found a way to stay in touch? Eleanor nodded. William was released a month later. Before leaving, he gave James a way to send messages through a network of Southern sympathizers living in the North. It was risky. If caught, James could be executed as a spy. Yet he took that risk, Emma said. For her. For her, Eleanor agreed. The first messages were simple. They shared stories about their childhoods, their hopes for after the war. But soon, Sarah asked if James could tell her about Union troop movements near her hometown. And he did? Just like that. Eleanor shook her head. Not at first. He refused, saying he couldn't betray his side. But then his unit was sent to a small Virginia town. The Union soldiers looted homes and businesses. James saw terrible things happen to the civilians there. She paused, her voice growing softer. He wrote to Sarah that night, telling her which towns the army was heading toward next, so people could hide their valuables or leave if needed. That's when he crossed the line, Emma said. He later wrote that he didn't see it as betraying the Union. He was just trying to protect innocent people. Eleanor coughed and Emma helped her sip some water. The more they wrote, the deeper in love they fell. They shared their deepest fears, their dreams. Sarah told him she wanted to teach school after the war. James said he wanted a small farm where he could live simply. When did Dr. Reynolds discover what they were doing? Emma asked. About a year into their correspondence. James was writing a letter in the medical tent, He worked as an orderly sometimes. Reynolds saw the coded message and confronted him. Eleanor smiled faintly. James was sure his life was over. Instead, Reynolds revealed he'd lost faith in both sides' leadership. Too many men dying for too little purpose. So he suggested they work together? Yes. Reynolds had contacts in the Confederate Medical Corps. He proposed using their communication to coordinate medical response after battles and to warn civilian areas. For the next 2 years their network grew. They saved many lives on both sides. Emma thought about this for a moment. But they were still betraying their countries. War isn't simple, Emma. Countries ask for total loyalty, but humans see the suffering on both sides. Eleanor's eyes held Emma's. Would you rather be loyal to a flag or prevent a child from being killed in the crossfire? I don't know, Emma admitted. Neither did they, Eleanor said. They question themselves constantly. There's a letter in that box where James asks Sarah if God will forgive them for what they're doing. She replied that she believed God cared more about saved lives than about which government claimed victory. Eleanor continued the story, explaining how James and Sarah managed to meet in person only 3 times during the war. Each meeting was brief and dangerous. Once, they met at a farmhouse that served as a field hospital for both sides. Another time, during a temporary truce to collect the dead, Sarah disguised herself as a nurse. Their third meeting was in Washington, where Sarah had gone under a false name. Their last meeting before the war ended was the most dangerous, Eleanor said. Sarah had come to Washington to pass along a warning about a Confederate raid planned on the Capitol. James arranged to meet her in a small boarding house. They had just 1 hour together. What happened? Emma asked. They pledged to find each other after the war no matter what. James gave her his mother's ring, not to wear as that would be too suspicious, but to keep as a promise. Eleanor smiled. That ring is in a small pouch at the bottom of the box. It's been passed down to the eldest daughter in each generation. Emma reached into the box and found a small leather pouch. Inside was a simple gold band with tiny flowers etched around it. It should go to your daughter someday, Eleanor said. But what about after the war? Emma asked, carefully returning the ring to its pouch. How did they find each other again? That was the hardest part, Eleanor said. When the war ended, James was still with the Union Army in Virginia. He tried to find Sarah, but her family home had been destroyed. No one knew where she and William had gone. Eleanor's voice grew tired, but she continued. For almost 3 years he searched while working odd jobs. Then he saw a small notice in a Richmond newspaper about a new school opening in a town in Tennessee. The teacher's name was listed as S. Thompson. So he found her? Emma asked. Eleanor nodded. He traveled there immediately. When he arrived at the school he found Sarah teaching a room full of children, both black and white, which was very unusual and brave at that time. And then they got married? Eventually. But it wasn't that simple. The South was bitter after the war. A Southern woman marrying a Union soldier would have faced terrible treatment. And if anyone discovered their wartime communications, both could have been tried. Eleanor sighed. So they created new identities. James took his mother's maiden name, Wilson. They moved to Kansas to start fresh where no one knew them. That's why there's no record of James Montgomery marrying Sarah Thompson, Emma realized. Exactly. They became James and Sarah Wilson. They told everyone they had met after the war. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. They lived with that lie for the rest of their lives. Always afraid someone might recognize them, might expose their past. How did you learn all this? Emma asked. If they kept it so secret? My mother, their daughter, found the letters after Sarah died. James finally told her everything before his own death. Eleanor closed her eyes briefly. He made her promise to protect the family from the truth. Back then, being known as the child of a traitor would have ruined her life. And she passed that burden to you, Emma said softly. Yes, Eleanor whispered. Each generation thinking they were protecting the next. But secrets have a weight, Emma. They press down on you over the years until you can hardly breathe. Emma looked at the frail woman in the bed, suddenly understanding the burden her grandmother had carried for decades. Thank you for trusting me with the truth, she said, taking Eleanor's hand. What will you do with it? Eleanor asked, her voice barely audible. Emma thought for a moment. I don't know yet. But whatever I decide, I'll make sure James and Sarah's real story isn't lost. The complicated, human truth of what they did and why they did it. Eleanor smiled, seeming satisfied. History isn't about heroes and villains, is it? It's about people making impossible choices in terrible times. Yes, Emma agreed. And sometimes the most heroic thing isn't charging into battle. Sometimes it's helping someone from the other side, or risking everything for love, or working to save lives when everyone around you is focused on taking them. Eleanor's eyes began to close, exhaustion overtaking her. "You understand?" she murmured. "I knew you would." As her grandmother drifted off to sleep, Emma sat quietly, holding the box of letters. Inside was a different kind of war story, not one of glory and clear moral victories, but of complex choices, unexpected connections, and the kind of quiet courage that rarely makes it into history books. The next morning, Emma arrived at the hospital to find her grandmother looking frilier than ever. The doctor had spoken to Emma's mother earlier. Eleanor didn't have much time left, perhaps only days or even hours. "You came back," Eleanor said when she saw Emma. Her voice was thin like tissue paper. "Of course I did," Emma replied, setting down her bag. Inside was the metal box, which she hadn't let out of her sight since discovering it. "How are you feeling?" "Ready," Eleanor said simply. "Ready to finish our talk. Ready for whatever comes after." Emma's mother Patricia was arranging flowers by the window. "Mom's been asking for you all morning. Says you two have unfinished business." She looked between them curiously. "What's this secret project you two are working on?" Emma and Eleanor exchanged a glance. "Just some old family stories," Emma said vaguely. Patricia shrugged. "Well, I'm going to meet Uncle Robert at the airport. He's flying in from Denver. I'll be back in a few hours." She kissed her mother's cheek. "Don't tire yourself out, Mom." After Patricia left, Eleanor motioned for Emma to come closer. "We need to talk about what happened after the war," she said. "About how James became a hero." Emma pulled out her notebook. She had started writing down the real story, trying to organize the truth. "You said there was a mix-up with another soldier named James Morrison?" "Yes," Eleanor confirmed. "It happened during the Battle of Gettysburg. James Morrison led a charge that helped hold an important position on Cemetery Ridge. It was truly heroic. He saved many lives." She paused, breathing deeply. "But in the chaos, the reports got the names confused. James Morrison died in the battle, and somehow the records showed it was James Montgomery who had performed the brave deed. And great-grandfather never corrected the mistake," Emma said. "No. When they came to award him a medal after the battle, he accepted it." Eleanor's face showed the complexity of her feelings. He was ashamed of what he did. But he was also afraid that if he drew attention to himself by pointing out the error, someone might investigate him more closely. "And discover his communication with Sarah," Emma finished. "Exactly." Eleanor reached for the cup of water on her bedside table, and Emma helped her take a sip. By then their network was extensive. They were helping to coordinate medical aid and civilian evacuations before major battles. If he was exposed, not only would he face execution, but many others in their network would be in danger too. Emma thought about the impossible position her great-grandfather had been in. So he accepted the recognition to protect others. "That was part of it," Eleanor admitted. But there was more. James had spent 2 years feeling like a coward because of what happened at Bull Run. Some part of him wanted to believe he could be the hero everyone suddenly thought he was. "Human nature," Emma said. "Yes." Eleanor's eyes grew distant. After the war, when he finally found Sarah and they married under new names, they thought they could leave it all behind. But then the pension came. Pension. For his heroic service. A monthly payment from the government. Eleanor looked troubled even now. They needed the money. They had taken in 3 orphan children by then. Sarah's school barely paid enough to feed them all. So they kept accepting it, Emma said. They did. And with each passing year, it became harder to tell the truth. Eleanor sighed. Then came the history books. Some minor historian included James Montgomery in a book about Gettysburg heroes. After that, local newspapers wanted interviews. People began pointing him out on the street. What did he do? He gave vague answers. Let people believe what they wanted to believe. The real James Morrison had no family left to claim his glory. Eleanor's hands twisted the edge of her blanket. But it ate at him. Sarah wrote in her diary that he would wake up screaming sometimes, dreaming that he was being unmasked as a fraud in front of the whole town. Emma felt a deep sadness for this man she had never known, caught between the myth others had created for him and the complicated reality of his life. When did people start collecting his letters and memorabilia? She asked. That happened later. After James died, my mother, their daughter Margaret, found all the real letters between James and Sarah. She was shocked by what she learned. Eleanor closed her eyes briefly. But by then James Montgomery was known as a war hero in their community. Her own husband had proudly told everyone he was married to a hero's daughter. So she created fake letters? Emma said, suddenly understanding. Yes. She burned many of the real ones that mentioned their secret communications. Then she wrote new letters, the kind a brave Union soldier might have written. Eleanor looked ashamed. She even bought a Union officer's sword at an antique shop and claimed it was his. The family Bible was altered to remove any mention of their life in Kansas under different names. A complete reinvention of the past, Emma marveled. Margaret was protecting herself and her children from being associated with what some would call treason. Eleanor looked at Emma intently. Can you understand why she did it? Emma nodded slowly. I think so. The country was still healing from the war. Being labeled as traitors' descendants would have haunted them all. Exactly. And once the lie was established, each generation felt obligated to maintain it. Eleanor reached for Emma's hand. Until now. They sat in silence for a moment, each lost in thought about how small choices and circumstances could shape a family's entire history. There's one more thing you should know, Eleanor said finally. About Dr. Reynolds. The Union doctor who discovered them? Yes. After the war, he wrote a journal about their network. He never used real names, just initials, but he documented how they saved lives on both sides. Eleanor's voice strengthened with pride. That journal is in the box too. It proves that while James may not have been the battlefield hero we claimed, he and Sarah did something perhaps more important. They chose humanity over loyalty to a side. Emma thought about the complicated legacy she was inheriting, the mythical hero her family had celebrated for generations, and the real man who had made difficult moral choices in impossible circumstances. What should I do with all this? She asked quietly. Eleanor studied her granddaughter's face. That's for you to decide. You're a history teacher. You understand better than most how we shape narratives about the past. The family would be shocked, Emma said. Mom has been so proud of our Civil War hero. Uncle Robert even named his son James after him. Yes, Eleanor acknowledged. The truth would change how they see our family history. But perhaps that's not entirely bad. What do you mean? The myth of the perfect hero is simple. The reality of a flawed human being making complex moral choices, that's harder to grasp but more truthful. Eleanor's blue eyes held Emma's gaze. In your classroom, don't you teach your students that history isn't just about battles and generals, but about ordinary people caught in extraordinary times? Emma nodded. I try to. Well, that's what this story really is. Eleanor squeezed Emma's hand with surprising strength. James and Sarah weren't perfect. They made mistakes, compromised their ideals sometimes, even benefited from a lie. But they also saved lives when they could have just focused on survival. They loved to cross boundaries when that was forbidden. There's a different kind of heroism in that story. A nurse came in to check Eleanor's vital signs, and they paused their conversation. When they were alone again, Eleanor looked exhausted. I should let you rest, Emma said, standing to leave. No, Eleanor said firmly. I've carried this secret too long. I need to finish. She took a labored breath. Whatever you decide to do with the truth, promise me one thing. What's that? Don't judge them too harshly. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. They were just people caught in a terrible war trying to do what they thought was right. I promise, Emma said, deeply moved. And remember the ring, Eleanor added. It's a reminder that love can cross the boundaries we create between us. In a time of hatred they chose love. There's something to be honored in that, even if the rest of the story isn't what we thought. As Emma left the hospital that evening, she felt the weight of her grandmother's confession. The family myth had been comfortable, simple, a clear hero to admire. The truth was messy, more morally ambiguous. Yet somehow, it felt more genuine, more human, and in its own way more heroic than the manufactured legend. 1 week later, Emma stood at the front of the funeral home, looking out at the gathered family members. Eleanor Montgomery Sullivan had passed away peacefully 3 days after sharing her final secrets. Now it fell to Emma as the eldest granddaughter to give the eulogy. My grandmother was a keeper of stories, Emma began. She connected us to our past, to where we came from. She helped us understand who we are. Emma glanced down at her notes, thinking of the metal box now hidden in her closet at home. Since her grandmother's death, she had read through all the letters and journals multiple times. She had verified what details she could through historical records. The story Eleanor had shared was true, a complex, human story far different from the family legend. Many of you know that our family has always taken pride in our Civil War ancestor, James Montgomery, Emma continued. Her mother nodded from the front row, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. Grandma Eleanor made sure we all knew about our connection to that important time in our nation's history. Emma paused, feeling the weight of the decision she had made the night before. After days of wrestling with what to do about the truth, she had chosen her path. But what Grandma Eleanor taught me most was that history isn't just about famous battles or simple heroes. It's about real people making difficult choices in impossible times. Emma looked around at her relatives. It's about ordinary people showing extraordinary courage, sometimes in ways that never make it into history books. She didn't reveal the family secret there in the funeral home. That would come later, in private conversations with her mother and uncles. For now, she honored her grandmother's life and her final gift, the truth that had been such a burden to her. After the service, family members gathered at Emma's mother's house. The medals and sword of James Montgomery were prominently displayed in the living room, as they had been for decades. Emma found herself staring at them, seeing them now as symbols not of battlefield heroism but of a complex family legacy of secrets and survival. Her Uncle Robert approached, holding a glass of iced tea. "Mom told me you two were working on some family history project before she died," he said. "Something about great-grandfather James?" Emma nodded. "Yes. She had some stories I'd never heard before." "Well, I hope you'll share them with the rest of us sometime," he said. "It's important to keep the family history alive." "I will," Emma promised. "But some of it might surprise you." That evening, after most of the relatives had left, Emma sat with her mother in the kitchen. "Mom, there's something I need to tell you about Grandma's last days," she began carefully. "About great-grandfather James." Patricia looked up from her coffee. "What about him?" Emma took a deep breath. "Grandma shared some information with me, information that changes what we thought we knew about him." Slowly, gently, Emma began to tell her mother the true story. She showed her the metal box and some of the original letters. Patricia's expressions ranged from disbelief to anger to tearful understanding as the real history of their family unfolded before her. "Why would Mom keep this from us all these years?" Patricia finally asked, holding Sarah's diary in her hands. "She was protecting us just like her mother protected her," Emma explained. "Each generation thought they were doing the right thing by maintaining the myth." "So everything we believed was a lie?" Patricia looked toward the living room where the medals sat in their display case. "Not everything," Emma said. "James and Sarah did show courage and compassion during the war. Just not in the way we thought. Their network saved many lives. They chose to help people on both sides when that was considered treason. But he took credit for another man's actions. He accepted medals he didn't earn." Patricia sounded disappointed, even hurt. "Yes," Emma acknowledged. "He made mistakes. He was flawed. But isn't there something more relatable, more human in that story than in the perfect hero we thought we had?" Patricia was quiet for a long time, turning the pages of Sarah's diary. Finally she looked up. "What do we do now? Tell everyone the family hero was actually a complicated man who made moral compromises? Display these real letters instead of the ones we thought were his?" "That's what I've been struggling with," Emma admitted. "I don't have an easy answer." Over the following weeks, Emma shared the truth with her uncles and cousins. Some were angry, feeling as if something had been stolen from them. Others were fascinated by the complex real story. They held a family meeting to decide what to do with James and Sarah's legacy. "I think we should donate the medals to a museum," Uncle Robert suggested. "They rightfully belong to James Morrison, even if we can't trace his family now." "And what about the real letters?" Emma's cousin Michael asked. "They're an important historical document about how ordinary people experienced the war." "We could donate copies to a university archive," Emma suggested. "But keep the originals in the family. They're part of our history now just as much as the myth was." 1 month after Eleanor's funeral, Emma stood in her classroom, looking at the 30 high school students watching her expectantly. On her desk was a carefully curated selection of the letters between James and Sarah. "Today we're going to talk about the Civil War differently," she began. "Not through the eyes of generals or presidents, but through the eyes of ordinary people caught in extraordinary circumstances." She held up one of the letters. "These are the words of my great-great-grandparents. Their story isn't simple. It doesn't fit neatly into categories of hero or villain, Union or Confederate. It's the story of two people who found something more important than the sides they were supposed to be loyal to." As she began to read from the letters, Emma felt a sense of peace. Eleanor's burden had been passed to her, but she had transformed it. What had been a heavy secret kept out of shame was becoming a teaching tool, a way to understand the human complexity that textbooks often missed. Later that evening, Emma sat at her desk at home writing in her journal. She had begun documenting the process of discovering her family's true history. Perhaps someday she would write a book, not to expose or embarrass her family, but to share the valuable lesson that history is always more complicated, more human than the simplified stories we often tell. She opened the small leather pouch and took out the gold ring that had been passed from Sarah to her daughter, and down through the generations. Emma slipped it onto her finger, thinking about the promise it had represented between two people who loved each other across the boundaries of a divided nation. "The truth sets us free," Eleanor had whispered during one of their final conversations. "Even when it's not the truth we wanted." Emma understood that now. The family myth had been comfortable but hollow. The real story, with all its moral complexity and human frailty, had a depth and authenticity that connected her more genuinely to her ancestors. She looked at the photo of Eleanor on her desk. "Thank you for trusting me with the truth," she said softly. "I'll make sure it's not forgotten." 6 months after Eleanor's funeral, Emma stood before a small gathering at the local historical society. Behind her was a display titled "Beyond Battlefield Heroes: Civilian Courage in the Civil War." At the center were copies of James and Sarah's letters, alongside Dr. Reynolds' journal documenting their network of civilian protection. "Thank you all for coming," Emma began. "This exhibit represents not just my family's story, but a different perspective on how ordinary people experienced the Civil War." In the front row sat Emma's mother Patricia, looking proud despite the difficult journey they had taken with the family truth. Next to her was Uncle Robert, who had initially been the most resistant to changing the family narrative but had gradually come to appreciate the authenticity of their real history. "For generations, my family believed we were descended from a conventional war hero," Emma continued. "We had the medals, the sword, the stories of battlefield bravery. But last year my grandmother revealed a different truth on her deathbed." Emma gestured to the display of letters behind her. "James Montgomery and Sarah Thompson were not the simple heroes or villains that Civil War stories often give us. They were complex people making difficult moral choices in impossible circumstances." As Emma shared a brief version of their story, how they met across enemy lines, how they worked to save civilian lives, and yes, how they benefited from a mistaken identity after the war, she watched her students from the high school nodding with interest. They had been the first to hear the story in her classroom, and several had helped create this exhibit. "History is not always what we think it is," Emma said. "The neat, simple stories we tell ourselves about the past often hide messier truths. Real people rarely fit perfectly into categories of hero or villain, right or wrong." She smiled at her family in the front row. "Sometimes the most meaningful histories are the complicated ones." After her presentation, people moved through the exhibit, reading excerpts from the letters and looking at maps showing the towns where James and Sarah's network had warned civilians before battles. Emma had worked with a historian from the local university to verify the details and provide historical context. "You did a beautiful job with this," Patricia said, hugging her daughter. "Mom would be proud." "Do you think so?" Emma asked. "She kept it secret her whole life." "She kept it secret because she thought she had to," Patricia replied. "But I think she always wanted the truth to be known. Why else would she have preserved all those letters? Why tell you at the very end of her life?" Emma nodded, thinking of those final conversations with her grandmother. She wanted the burden lifted, but she also wanted James and Sarah's real story told. Uncle Robert joined them, looking thoughtfully at the exhibit. "You know, when you first told me the truth, I was angry. I felt like you were taking away our family hero." He gestured to the display. "But this is actually a better story. More real." "It's certainly more human," Emma agreed. Later that evening, Emma drove to the cemetery where Eleanor was buried. The spring air was warm and wildflowers were beginning to bloom between the gravestones. She placed a small bouquet on her grandmother's grave. "It's done, Grandma," she said quietly. "The truth is out, at least in our family and our community. No more secrets, no more burden to carry." She sat on the grass beside the grave, thinking about how the past 6 months had changed her. Teaching history felt different now. She found herself constantly looking for the human stories behind the textbook versions, helping her students understand the moral complexity that real people faced in historical events. The gold ring, Sarah's ring, now hung on a chain around Emma's neck. She touched it thoughtfully. "I'm not sure if I did exactly what you would have wanted," she continued. "But I tried to honor the real James and Sarah, not as perfect heroes, but as people who did their best in terrible times, who sometimes failed, who sometimes chose love and compassion over loyalty to a side." As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the cemetery, Emma thought about the stories we tell ourselves about the past, and how those stories shape who we believe we are. Her family had lost a simple hero narrative, but gained something more valuable: a connection to the complex, messy, genuine humanity of their ancestors. The war didn't end in 1865, Emma's grandmother had told her during one of their final conversations. The divisions, the healing, the coming to terms with what happened, that continues through each generation. Emma understood that now in a way she never had before. The Civil War wasn't just a chapter in a history textbook or a collection of battlefield monuments. It lived on in family stories, in hidden truths, in the ongoing struggle to understand our shared past. She stood and brushed the grass from her clothes. "Goodbye, Grandma," she said. "Thank you for trusting me with the truth." As Emma walked back to her car, she thought about the metal box now displayed at the Historical Society. The contents had been a burden for 3 generations of her family. Before Emma, they had become something else: a gift. A reminder that history, like the people who make it, is always more complex, more human, and ultimately more meaningful than the simplified stories we often prefer to tell. The real James and Sarah had not been perfect. They had made mistakes, compromised their ideals sometimes, even benefited from a misunderstanding that gave them unearned recognition. But they had also chosen compassion when hatred was easier, saved lives when taking them was expected, and found love across boundaries designed to keep people apart. There was a different kind of heroism in that story, not the kind that earned medals and monuments, but perhaps the kind that mattered more in the long, complicated process of healing a nation's wounds. Emma started her car, glancing once more at her grandmother's grave. The burden had been passed to her, but she had transformed it from a secret kept out of shame into a truth shared with understanding. And in doing so, she had found a deeper connection not just to her family's past, but to the complexity of history itself. "The past isn't dead," Emma often told her students, quoting Faulkner. "It isn't even past." She understood that now in a way she never had before. And as she drove away from the cemetery into the gathering dusk, she felt at peace with her decision to bring her family's hidden history into the light.